Welcome to the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan campus in Hong Kong. And to our second Trailblazer Forum, I wanted to welcome again Francis and Rose for being here today, among many of our other university alumni. My name's Mark Barnico. I'm the executive director of the campus here in Hong Kong. And just as a reminder, for those of you that may be new to our campus here, I wanted to mention that we do offer a world-class EMBA program out of this campus. We offer executive education out of this campus. We have study abroad from our college alums, college students who come to this campus to learn from their faculty members. So in addition, we have so many programs, especially during COVID, when we've been, just like everybody, facing a lot of challenges having faculty and students come to Hong Kong. We have many online programs that you can find on our website at www.uchicago.hk. We're on Facebook, Instagram, all the major social media outlets. And so if you want to find out what we're up to here on campus, you can go to those, the website or go to those social media outlets. Today I'm delighted to have Ellana Lee join us. She's a senior vice president and managing editor, Asia Pacific for CNN International, and global head of features content for CNN International and CNN Digital. Ellana is based in Hong Kong. She's here in the Asia Pacific headquarters and is one of the network's most senior executives outside of the United States. Ellana manages CNN's award-winning on-air news programming from Pakistan to Japan and from China to New Zealand. She manages correspondence and news gathering teams across the entire region. And she's responsible for the partnership between CNN's international editorial and commercial teams, helping to drive network business outside the United States. Ellana is also committed to one of the most important stories of our generation, the climate crisis. I hope we can talk about that today, and recognizes the important role media can play in the green revolution. In 2021, CNN launched Call to Earth Day, a global initiative spearheaded by Lee dedicated to conservation, environmentalism, and sustainability. Under her leadership, CNN has received numerous awards in a variety of prestigious awards, including an Emmy in 2022, Best Documentary Film from the Environmental Media Association in 2020, the Best COVID-19 Factual Feature at the 2020 Content Asia Awards, and other accolades, including the Breaking News Award for coverage of the Hong Kong protests in 2019. She's had 5 award wins at the Asia Academy Creative Awards in 2018 and received numerous personal accolades as well, including being named Asia Media Woman of the Year in 2018. I found it really interesting in her bio that Ellana has been to North Korea several times, and she was involved in the historic Korean and Trump-Kim summits in both 2019 and 2018. We'll talk about that today as well. And she's traveled to North Korea several times and spearheaded an exclusive report called Secret State Inside North Korea, which was awarded a Best Documentary Program at the Asia Academy Creative Awards. In recognition of Ellana's leadership, she was named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum and now sits on the Young Global Leaders Foundation. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Nature Conservancy's Asia Pacific Council. Ellana holds a master's degree in broadcast journalism from New York University and an undergraduate degree in history and international relations from Georgetown University. I'd like to invite Ellana to come up to the stage. Please join me to welcome Ellana Lee. Ellana and I met each other about 2 years ago at a dinner party and probably talked for 2 hours, the entire dinner party. And when I was thinking about the Trailblazer Forum, Ellana was one of the top on my list of people to have come to our beautiful campus here and to talk about her experiences and where things are at with CNN in Asia. But I guess before we get started talking about the business side of the things that you're involved with, tell us a little bit about how you came into journalism. You've 25 years now, you're celebrating 25 years at CNN. How'd you get started? What was your path? I think a lot of our students would like to hear that.
So yeah, 25 years. I always forget that, and then our press department always likes to remind me it's been 25 years at CNN. But in terms of how I got started, I mean, look, I grew up in South Korea. I grew up in South Korea during the 70s and 80s. It was a tumultuous time. You know, when I was in high school, we'd have tear gas in next door university, and that's sort of our classroom environment. And from there, I've always, I knew I would have to go to the US for university. Once I was in university, I was called back to Korea. And this is quite a private situation, but I realize this is streaming, so nothing private about it. But just to give you a sense of why journalism, I went back to Korea and we were transitioning from a very military, authoritarian society to a democratic society, which you think sounds really great. But with democracy comes a flourishing of different segments of society. And one of them was journalism, media. Unfortunately, not media is created equally. And there were the old established media, but there were a lot of tabloids. There are a lot of people who became journalists who actually didn't know what fact checking was. And it was during the time that my parents had divorced. And I actually read about my parents' divorce in the newspaper. And so it was a very kind of a shocking moment for me sitting at Georgetown as a freshman. And I was called back to stay home instead of being bombarded by all these false and fake news. So that was my first experience with media. And to be honest, that was the reason why I got curious about this medium that could really help people, but also destroy people. And I had a curiosity, and luckily that curiosity brought me back to university. And so I studied it at Georgetown. I did an internship at CNN. I interned my entire last fourth year, senior year. I had no weekends. I did research, I got lunch, I printed everything out, and then, but that got me curious enough to go to NYU for journalism school. And so then from there, my professor said, you know what? There's an outlet called CNN. Don't go to the UM because it's really boring, but go to this new outlet they created called CNN Financial News. And but I had no concept of financial news. But my boss said, hey, welcome to CNN Financial News. Here's the Wall Street Journal. Read it every single day, every morning, and come be prepared to learn. And that's kind of how I started at CNN.
Now, if you go way back when you were growing up as a young girl in South Korea, did you ever imagine yourself in this role today, or did you aspire to do something else with your life at that time?
Our family was a very politically minded family. I was surrounded by politicians and politics and business. So our conversations were usually about politics and international relations. So I always thought that I would probably go into some area of that nature. And Georgetown, as you know, is a place for international relations. So it was a natural progression. But when you go to Georgetown, you either go to the Capitol Hill or you become a lawyer. I didn't want to do either, but I wanted to make use of my degree, and that's where I found media to be far more dynamic and far more interesting, and similarly impactful. I clearly, from my personal experience, it definitely was an impact, whether good or bad, and so that's where I decided to do.
One question I have for you is, it's rare in this day and age for people to stay with one company for so long.
Yeah.
What motivates you to stay at CNN? You know, we live in a world where people are changing all the time.
Right.
What drives you?
So if I speak to the younger generation or millennials, I still think I'm a part of the younger generation. But if I do speak with the millennials and they ask me, how long have you been at CNN? I say 25 years. I start to see their face cringe where they're trying to be respectful to me and smile. But part of them are like, are you crazy? How can you stay in one corporation for 25 years? Their thought is probably, I'll move every couple of years. But I have to say, you've heard about the 3-year itch, right? Like 3-4 years, you stay in one corporation, one entity, and you kind of start to get curious and a bit agitated, figuring out what's next. And there was a time when I was in New York and we would communicate with our colleagues in Atlanta, where the international hub was based. I would ask, like, how long have you been at CNN? And they'd be like, oh, I've been here for 11 years. And inside I'd be like, wow, I'm never gonna be you. I'm gonna be moving ahead of this position in 3 years or times. But what I realized at every step, whether 3-year itch came or not, my values were best aligned with CNN. I think what the younger generation wants in terms of values, what they get, as much as they put in what they get, and does my value best align with where I'm working? For me, that was CNN.
Can you elaborate on that? Your values, like how would you represent those?
So, I mean, it's broad in some ways, but if I just look back at me personally, I speak English, I think like a Westerner, but I believe and I feel like a Korean and an Asian. I have those values. At times they clash with each other. The identity that I have when I was studying in the US and I was a minor at that time. Right now, I can say I'm from Korea and everyone would treat me quite decently considering K-pop and BTS and everything. But back in 1980s, it was pretty rough at times. When I was in prep school, someone would say, "Hey, do you even have meat in your country? And are you coming from North or South Korea?" We were not a known entity. And so, CNN provides a place where me being different is okay. They respect that. They respect what I have to say. And they give me a platform to say that and to give my ideas. It may not all be agreed upon, but at least it's a voice. And I find that to be very valuable. And the further I stay, I find that to be very unique. And also the diversity of our teams. We always say that we're almost like a mini UN, and it really feels like a mini United Nations, which means you're having diverse cultures, diverse conversations, diverse opinions. But it's a safe place where we can have those kind of conversations and not have any repercussions as well. And a lot of times, those diverse values are presented on air, which is the ultimate reward, I think, in many ways. And so for me, yes, I know media is always under attack in many ways, but I feel my values are best aligned with a corporation like CNN and where we're so global.
Let's go back to the Wall Street Journal. You're an intern. You're reading it every day. What happened after that? Like, how did you start to rise up in the organization?
So, finance news was really exciting in New York City at that time. The Nasdaq was hitting, records, but I had no idea about finance news. I remember my producer said, and I was just literally entering because she said, "I want you to find out about this company and call analyst XXX on Wall Street." And I called them up, I rang them up and say, "I'm from CNN," so they don't hang up on you because you're from CNN. So they'll take your call, which is really nice. But the problem is after that. I was asking some questions, which I thought was pretty decent. And then she was giving me some information about the market cap of this company is XXX. And I said, "I'm sorry really to ask you this, but what is a market cap?" And she said, "If you don't know what a market cap is and you're calling me for CNN financial news, you're not worth my time." And she hung up on me. And so then I really read the Wall Street Journal every day, because back then the Wall Street Journal they would say, if they would say something like market cap, they would explain what market cap was. It's a very different paper today. So I just studied it and I got interested in it. And I just realized that everything about news in some form or fashion is business news. And one of the first stories I was asked to go into the field for was the 1997 financial crisis. And it happened to be in South Korea. And so they thought, "Hey, you're from Korea. Why don't you go translate for the team and make sure they don't get lost?" So I was set on a plane. I arrived in South Korea, and it was a very different country from the one that I left. The crisis was, you can feel it in the air. And so that was my entry, but I had a curiosity and an openness. And even though I was more inclined for politics, I realized that this was a great opportunity and it was exciting. And it was exciting to be in New York. And it was exciting to be in business. So I stayed and then continued up, I guess.
I'm just curious about that curiosity that you have. Was that something you had as a young girl, especially growing up in the circumstances and the family that you grew up in? Or is it something that you picked up with your Western education?
No, I think when you grew up in South Korea, you're very mindful from a young age where you are, where your place in the world is. I was very mindful where my place was within my family. I was very mindful where I was as a citizen of South Korea. we were, you know that you have a lot to be thankful for to to America for the war, etc. But then you're squeezed between China and Japan, and the powerful Japan at that time. So you know your place very quickly. You learn about it, and then I was very curious about connecting the dots. Who, as us, as an entity, as a country, what can we stand on? What's going to make us be taken seriously in this world? And so connecting those dots from a young age, I think that's what's helped me in CNN as well, to try to connect the dots. At the end of the day, as journalists, you have to ask yourself, what's your role? And a lot of your role is to really, connect the dots, to find some similarities as well, so that you realize maybe countries may be having differences, but at the core of it, what connects us? And that's what we try to do and explain and read between the lines.
So, so then how did you come to Asia? Tell us a little bit about that. How long were you in New York or Atlanta, wherever?
So I was in New York, and the reason I came to Asia is because there's two things. Number one, my father was not physically doing well. He was having some health issues, and I realized I didn't want to be on a plane for 16 hours in case something happened. And I spent so much time in the US. And so I decided to just take a sabbatical. In those days, CNN gave you sabbaticals, which was really nice. So I took 3 months off, and I stayed in Korea. But every time the day inched to going back to New York, I just dreaded it. So I called my boss at that time, and I said, look, I'm going to resign. I didn't have a job. I didn't have anything lined up, but I have to give my parents credit. They said, if you don't want to go back, you don't have to go back. You can stay. And they gave me that confidence, which is why I called my boss and said, I'm not going to come back. And she said, you know what? Don't quit. Instead, I'm going to move you from CNN USA to CNN International. And there's this place called Hong Kong. We've just opened up a bureau. It's going to be the Asia headquarters. Why don't you go there for 2 years? You can be close to your parents. Your father will get better in the meantime. And then why don't you come back to New York? And I thought that was we struck a deal when I was in McDonald's in South Korea, and it just happened. And so I was like, okay, maybe this is meant to be. And so that's why I came to Asia, and that's why I came to Hong Kong with 2 suitcases.
And that was 2001.
That was 2001.
Okay.
Yeah.
So looking back at your time in the US with CNN and looking forward in your time in Asia with CNN, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've had to face, and how different are the challenges based on the location?
Well, the challenges, they vary by at which level you are in, where you are. But for me, the challenge was physical. I would say, for the first thing, you wake up in Asia Pacific with a time zone deficit. I think we all recognize that working for multi-organizations. So just managing that. But number two, I arrived in Hong Kong and I didn't read my contract. So I didn't realize which show they put me on. I was just so grateful for them to give me a job, and I didn't realize they asked me to produce a 6 a.m. show, which basically meant I arrived on a Saturday and I went to work on a Sunday at 1 a.m. And I did that for 4.5 years. So I was sleeping while you were awake, and I was awake while you were sleeping. And so I worked under those kind of conditions for 4.5 years, which is for me incredibly challenging. But in Korea, we have a saying that if you're going to suffer, you should suffer when you're young. And so I'm very, very grateful I did that when I was young, because if young people come to me nowadays and say, I'm not sleeping well, I say, well, I haven't either. So it's a passage of right. But then from there, there's other challenges. I don't even know where to begin, because when you take on as a management role, for example, if you're the youngest girl and you're in management and your job is to go around the region and meet people, it's a very interesting experience in that capacity as well. So yeah, I don't quite know where to start.
Was that an issue in the States as well? I mean, being a young executive and dealing.
No, because in the States I wasn't an executive, so that wasn't as much of a challenge. I think in Asia Pacific, they were quite surprised to see a young Asian female represent an American company in any of the meetings. So I always talk about when I first started and went out and meet government officials or business officials, even though I would be sitting here and they would be sitting there, they would always speak to a gentleman on the left or right, and then they would look at me to translate. And, you know, I could see the horror of the person sitting next to me saying, no, she's actually my boss. And so in the beginning, I have to say, I felt a little like emotionally distraught. And then I realized I just started to have fun with it. You know, you got to like let things go. And as years passed, I think as they got used to women in certain positions and their daughters were in certain positions, they got used to it. And it's a much easier process now. But back then, I was always a translator.
I'd like to kind of turn to CNN in Asia itself, in Hong Kong and Asia. CNN was the first 24-hour cable network that had been in China since 1987, if I got my facts right. How has the news industry changed in that 35-year period of time?
We can probably do a whole class on that, how the news has changed. But I would say there are a couple of moments that have changed, at least in my experience. You know, when the Sichuan earthquake happened in 2008, I believe, no, yeah, in 2008, I believe, I heard about the Sichuan earthquake through this small, little, tiny medium called Twitter. Someone came into my office and said, hey, Ellana, have you seen this thing? It's called Twitter. I say, no, I haven't heard about this. Well, on Twitter, it says there's this massive earthquake in China. And I remember that moment so well because I was in Oxford House and I had no Oxford House and I didn't realize what Twitter was. But then since then, the world has completely changed in terms of the media landscape with social media. And since we know more than what Twitter is, but we know about the other social medias. And the reason I mention social media is because in the old days, news used to be generated where we would verify the facts after our reporters would land in the location. They would be the eyewitnesses of the world, which is why foreign correspondents were so revered in many ways, because they would be able to travel to faraway places, be the eyewitness for us, and share with us what they saw. But with the social media medium, so many things are happening, but you have to make sure that what is happening is really taking place and it's true. So this is where fake news comes in many ways. And I remember that has completely changed us. Even for now, when we're in all parts of the world, we're in Ukraine, we're in Japan, we're in Thailand, we're in all these different places, we have to verify everything that comes across our desk. And that process is incredibly laborious, but it's incredibly important so that we are not misjudging the situation, we're not putting up fake news, we're not putting fake photos on our platforms. So I would say social media in many ways has changed that. It's changed the business as well, where some social medias take our content without paying for it and just take it arbitrarily. I think that's impacted the business model as well. So there's many ways that I think media certainly has changed over the course of the last couple of years.
Can you help the average non-journalist understand how to be discriminating when it comes to news and to delineate between real news and fake news? Do you have any tips?
So in some ways, you know, I start my morning every day at 8:45 with an editorial meeting. And we have this meeting where most of the 8 cities, maybe some cities who are too early in the morning, participate. But we have this editorial meeting in every hub. So we have it in Hong Kong, we have it in Abu Dhabi, we have it in London, and we have it in New York City. And in that meeting, a lot is generated because you have a lot of news that's generated overnight and during the day. And we have to make a decision what we decide to cover. But I always say it's actually beyond what's really important to cover. The important decision is what you decide not to cover. Because there's so much news out there. We're not a local brand. I will never compete with a local channel. But there are some key themes that are absolutely imperative for us to cover as an international organization. So I would say that would be that would be one aspect. The other aspect of it is we have to consistently make sure what we are putting on our platform is true. And so we have teams sitting in Hong Kong, for example, when the war is happening in Ukraine. We have to figure out how is it that this video is actually true and it's taken place, or even footages. So we will use a lot of open source opportunities where even you can use NASA technology. NASA technology, there's a platform called Firms, for example, if you're not aware of it. It shows every single fire happening on the planet through satellite technology. So if you're in a war zone and that city, that street, that building has been blown up and there's a fire, it will be captured by the NASA technologies. So we will have to verify, even what we see, we'll have to verify, is this fire really for happening? We would use Google reverse imaging to make sure that that building we are looking at, actually it really exists, because we've had situations during the Green Revolution when people would send us pictures and the building actually doesn't exist, you know? And that's coming from both sides. So the verification process is incredibly laborious, but it's probably the most important thing before we put it out on any of our platforms.
This is probably a good segue, talking about fake news, to talk about your experience in North Korea, but not specifically about North Korea, but the Trump-Kim summit with Donald Trump, our master of fake news. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, he should be in marketing, actually, I think. I mean, he's the master of slogans and fake news. The whole point, the problem though, is that I'm sure you all recognize fake news has existed before Donald Trump. But the way Donald Trump used fake news is he considered every news that he didn't like or believe in, he considered that fake news. But then people just got confused, thinking there's really fake news out there. There is, right? So that's been a very tumultuous time for us. It might have been an exciting time, a dynamic time, but it was a tumultuous time. And yes, we're CNN, and we have our share, we receive our share criticisms of, you know, do we put too much of Donald Trump on our air? The fascinating thing about, I do think about Donald Trump is that, and it is a very sad thing as well, just to share with you, Donald Trump actually has really impacted the security and the livelihood of many journalists. He really, it was beyond a slogan. He actually called for people to target journalists. We became targets in many areas, in many places, especially in the United States. Many of our people had to be protected. You know, usually you think you go into a war zone and go with security, but not in the middle of America, that you'd have to find security to protect you. And so he really changed the climate of the relationship between journalism and people out there who want to do some damage. So I really feel that there's a lot of after effects of Donald Trump that we are still, that's long. He may not be so much in the center stage, but there's a lot of what he did that actually we have to, that we're paying for.
That was my next question. Has it like exacerbated as much on the left as it is on the right from how Trump started all of these things? Or
I think there's a couple of, absolutely, and I think there's a couple of revelations. I mean, the one revelation I would say Donald Trump did show us that there's a part of America that we were not paying attention to. And I think that's a very legitimate criticism of the media. That's a legitimate criticism, and the voters spoke at that time. And so we also had a very inward conversations amongst ourselves. It's very important journalists are not only on the East Coast, on the West Coast. The journalists should be in the South, in the middle, because it's a diverse country. And maybe we weren't listening and hearing as much as places that were not so much in the established cities. So that was a wake-up call. And I think that was a really good wake-up call and a very needed wake-up call. But on the other front, as I mentioned, the war against journalists, that was pretty personal. And that was pretty, there are times where you get scared that you work for media organizations. For example, like in all our field troops here in Asia Pacific and internationally, you won't see our logo anywhere. I remember going to North Korea and we were covering the one of the major parades, and our partner, our minder, was saying, you know, the chairman is watching, but he can't pinpoint you where you are. You need to be showing us that you're CNN. Why don't you have your logo on your cameras and your clothing and hats so the chairman can just see who you are? Because he's the one who allowed you to come into this country and to document this parade. And we didn't realize how important that was, because for us, for security reasons, we don't put any of those logos on our bags, on our clothes, or anywhere. And so it was a different mindset, and that was more profound when we were going through these really difficult times, when you had leader of a very powerful nation waging war against journalists.
Is there any way that we'll be able to put the genie back in the bottle, or is it too far gone at this point in terms of fake news and the media, all the challenges that you face?
I'm not sure if you can put the genie in the back in the bottle, but I think for us, it's we come from the fact that we find ourselves in an incredibly privileged position to do what we do, but two, we realize the responsibility is greater because there is so much fake news out there. We need to make sure everything that we do is absolutely verified, and we put 100% our stamp of our name when we release that news on digital, on television, on social. We're not perfect, you know, we will make mistakes at times, but I think we are an organization that if we do make mistakes, we will state that as well. But we will do whatever we can to make sure that the news we put is verifiable. And we have a whole machine that does that and spends a lot of time doing that. And that's where I think with news, with social media, if anything, social media has shown there's more of a place for legitimate news organizations to be. And I also am a firm believer that there's a place for international news to thrive in.
Let's turn to Hong Kong and talk a little bit about Hong Kong over the last 3 years and CNN's, long-term plans. Maybe you could talk about that, and also talk about how things have changed at CNN in general during the protests of 2019, COVID, and the NSL.
I think the reason Mark and I kind of connected over dinner was that it was 2 years ago, and Mark asked me, so you're CNN, are you gonna stay or are you gonna leave? And I said, I'm absolutely committed to staying. And I think that's what kind of shocked you and said, tell me why. Look, look, it's absolutely true. The last couple of years have changed the terrain, the environment we are living in right now. When I received the NSL book, literally going into July 1st, and it was like 11 something p.m. It was dense. I read through every single 66 articles, and I had to ask myself, what does this mean for us? I've got, a sizable operation here. We are based in Hong Kong. Are we going to be able to remain here? And I think that was a very common question, not only for us, but for many multinational organizations. But true, I like to compare ourselves sometimes as like journalists as firefighters. When there's a fire, we don't walk out, we walk in. And for me, there's probably no other story more important as we look at the history than the tectonic shifts that's taking place between what's happening with China, the United States, and obviously what's happening in Europe. So why would I leave? But there are a lot of other considerations to put in place. I've got 8 cities around Asia Pacific. Not all cities are this size, because the reason we are here and we have a sizable staff here is because we can guarantee security, we can guarantee safety, we can guarantee there's no firewall, we can guarantee the judicial system, and we are invited. There are certain cities where we have to limit the number of people we have because it's a safety issue, but we still want to be and have a presence in those countries. So, all of those things came into question, but I have to at the same time admit that while the NSL law was very shocking for us when we first read it, what's really impacted us in the last 2 years hasn't been the NSL law. It's been really the COVID regulations, because 90% of my team are expats. We've got families. We've got, people who live far away from us. I've had people who had to go through funerals over Zoom. This impacted us far more than the NSL law. And right now, I'm really, really happy to say, and I'm really happy, and like many of you in this room, that I feel like we're turning a tide. We're turning a corner, and there's a little bit more optimism in the air, and I really do believe in that optimism.
What can I say to people in the States who ask me about the NSL and the impact of the NSL and are still nervous about coming to Hong Kong because of the NSL? What can I say to them?
Number one, I think you need to visit, but I think we need to be truthful. We're all trying to figure this out, right? There are four main areas about the NSO, whether it's like succession, subversion, terrorism, collusion. And we had to ask ourselves as well, what does collusion mean? As a media organization, if I put someone who is a dissenter and we put them on air as an interviewee, does that mean we are colluding? These are really practical questions that we need to ask. We have, and we have not been jailed for it. It's incredibly broad in many ways, which is in some ways very helpful, but in some ways it's not helpful because you just don't know when those laws will be enacted, right? So we are trying to figure things out as we go. But having said that, I really do believe that despite the rules and the rules have altered a bit, there is a desire to make sure Hong Kong is still one of the most important livable cities globally. There is a greatness to Hong Kong that I believe existed before, but there isn't a desire to stamp that out. It's how we are going to coexist, and that's what we're trying to figure out. But I would say in the last couple of weeks, with the measures that have come out, and opening it up more to the international community, I'm very optimistic. And I was just thinking about what made Hong Kong great. We had a situation many, many years ago where there was a breaking news in a particular country, which I won't mention, but obviously is not as efficient as Hong Kong. We managed to send a crew from here to that location of a breaking news location. They were able to show up in that scene than the officials in that country. And that was the efficiency of Hong Kong. That was almost the greatness of Hong Kong that allowed us to do what we do in such an efficient way. And I hope that we'll get back to that.
Chicago is known for its value of free expression. Do you think that we'll be able to maintain our own values in Hong Kong under the NSL, just based on your experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, right now, if I don't think that we are going to be able to do what we do without any shackles on us, I wouldn't be here. I think that's, we have to do what we need to do without any hesitation. And so far, we haven't had any of those pushbacks from the government. Yeah, they may complain about what an article we wrote, but that's nothing. I mean, that's nothing compared to a lot of these other countries that we operate in. People pushing back on what you've written. We've had those kind of conversations all the time. What I'm happy to say, though, is that there may be pushback, but there is also follow-up from our side, and it is registered. And so there's a conversation, and we come to a place where we agree to disagree. And I think that's something that is more reasonable. Now, if it becomes a far more different environment, so for example, for me, there are 4 trigger points of when I think then this will not be attainable. One is very simple: if we're not invited. As I mentioned, a large portion of our teams are expats. We live here based on the invitation through visas. And a way a country tells you where you don't want you to be here is if they don't give you visas. So A, if they don't give us visas. 2, if the firewall goes up. 3, if we feel like there is a security threat to our lives. And 4 would be the judiciary system. If we feel like we would not have a fair share in court, then those are the 4 key things, at least I can see. If any of those 4s are chipped away significantly, then we will have to rethink our position. But so far, the conversations we've had have been encouraging, to be honest. And now we're in a stage where the COVID rules are relaxing, and we can do what we do freely.
I think that's a great framework. Thanks for sharing that. I'd like to get into your passion projects, women's rights and climate change. Could you tell us how you got involved in being interested in those and the kinds of things that you're working on to help advocate for women and the climate?
Well, for me, it's not just so much about women, it's about the diversity. I just have a very simple goal, is that I believe my newsroom needs to reflect the world that we cover. And we cannot come through a DC consensus. Well, we shouldn't come through a Beijing consensus either. But it has to have a variety of people responsible for the news that's covering international news especially. So what does that mean? It's harder than you think, because you have to go out and make sure your recruitment is strong, your recruitment is diverse, you're bringing people from all parts of the world. And so far, luckily, we haven't had a visa rejected, and we've been able to bring people in from all parts of the world to sit in our newsrooms here in Hong Kong. So for me, it's more than just about gender equality. It's about the diversity. Number two, though, I would say when it comes to women, I would say the reason I concentrate on it is that when I look at these press releases or people talking about how can we get more women on boards, to me, I feel like it's kind of missing the point, because that's just concentrating at the top. If you're not concentrating in the middle pipeline, you're definitely not going to get anyone sitting on boards at the top. And it's about what can we do as a corporation, as a society, to keep those who find it at times very difficult to stay in the middle, the middle pipeline. And the reason I say that is because, you know, women go through different phases of their lives, correct? You know, whether you're having a family, you know, how much are you going to get support of the family? How much are you going to get support from the corporation when you're going to have a family? They're constantly torn. So for my goal in our newsroom is trying to make sure we support them in their middle pipeline, so they don't feel like they have to choose. I had one person come to me before and say, look, I'm not going to apply for this promotion. I'd like to apply for the promotion, but I'm not, because I feel like I have to choose between the promotion and my children. And for me, that's not a decision. They shouldn't be making those choices. They shouldn't have to make those choices. We should create an environment where they can still move up the corporate ladder, but they can also be there for their children. And it's about what policies do we have. And I think that's something I'm concentrating more on. Even like the paternity, you know, here in Hong Kong, you know, men don't get a lot of days to spend time with their children and their babies. And so we unilaterally decided we are not going to follow the Hong Kong rules. We will follow the US rules, and we will give proper months off for men to support the women, ultimately supporting the women, but also for them to connect with their children. And so that's where I think I can have some influence, if anything, in my corporation. And that's what I'm trying to do.
And you're on the CNN International Diversity Council. What is the work of the council?
So the work of the there's several things. We want to make sure, for example, I give you a really simple example. We have a conversation about, let's say, East Asia, right? And you would ask us, why do you always have Westerners on air speaking about East Asia? There's two aspects to it. One, we are trying to do a better job in finding people who are willing to speak from this part of the world and who are not afraid to speak. Because you'd be surprised, when we call people from this part of the world, they're 99% very shy and unwilling. But that's why then you consistently have people from different parts of the world talking about this region. So I think there's a collective responsibility for everybody here to feel a bit more, I don't know, confident to speak about this part of the world. And that's number one, that's really hard. But we are trying to make sure that the voices you see on our air are well represented and are balanced. And so you're not seeing people only from London or from New York or from DC or from Los Angeles. It's really important for me that the voices you see on air are reflective of the world we cover once again. And so those are the things, those are what we work on. We try to work on the talent to make sure even the talents that are on air, they're diverse. They come from different backgrounds, they come from different educations, they come from different countries. And I think that's really important. So when you see on air, you see a diverse team that represents, but also they serve an incredibly important part when it comes to internal discussions, our internal battles, our internal discussions. You know, what they bring into our newsroom is absolutely priceless. And so that's the work that we do. So we spend a lot of time on recruitment, a lot of time, how can we make sure that the decisions we make are also reflected on air?
Is there equity at CNN in terms of the American staff in dealing with staff around the world?
What does that mean? Sorry.
Are your staff here in Asia treated with equity, with
Absolutely. No, absolutely. But I would say though, the difficulty is the time zone. You know how many times you have all these meetings and it's in your calendar and it's like at 1 a.m, right? And you have to remind them, we're 12 hours different from you, or sometimes we're going to be 13 hours. Even that 1 hour difference, it's so painful at times. So it's just making sure they understand that for us to have a global conversation, it needs to be at a certain time that captures everyone from around the world. But there's absolute respect and equity. And it goes back to the value. If I didn't feel that, that I didn't have that, I don't think a lot of us would be here working at CNN.
That's fantastic. Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I'm sure there are many. What would you recommend to our university students who want to follow a career path like yours?
I mean, to be honest, these days, I don't really, I feel like I'm not in a position to give advice because I actually receive advice. The beauty that we have is it's almost like reverse mentoring. We have students who just joined us maybe a year or 2 years ago. And I actually called one up today, a colleague of mine today, say, hey, I'm going to this event and there might be students, what should I say? And I receive advice from them to help me walk through my days and what's supposed to be important for us. But there are two things I would say in this, and this is one actually advice that she gave me. She graduated from HKU, and if you're a journalist, they make sure you get a second degree. I guess it shows that maybe if you don't make it as a journalist and it's not the most lucrative job, that you have something to fall back on. So there's practical advice there. But for people who are interested in what I do, I would say you have to really just go and travel and experience. I think COVID has been damaging in many, many ways, but it's really interesting. With COVID, we've become so isolated that we're almost having to relearn how to rejoin societies. When I was in London a couple of weeks ago, I have to say I felt really quite nervous in actually taking my mask off and having a conversation and going to places. I think we need to re-engage with the world. And I think with young people who have the option and opportunity, they need to experience with their feet. The worst thing about journalists, if you are a journalist by computer, you have to experience it yourself. And I think with anyone's interested in this field, they should do that. And also I think that you don't have to go to journalism school to be a journalist. I think if you have specialties in international relations, into business, all these different areas is what makes you a better journalist. And the speciality is really quite important.
It's interesting that you say that about sort of re-engaging after COVID, because I felt it myself, just sort of having to kind of rethink like social behavior in a group setting now that we're kind of coming back together.
And for us as well, we used to go to the last time I was in North Korea was pre-COVID. North Korea is not a place where you can fax an internet and maintain your relationships. You physically have to go, and we just haven't been able to do that. So even as journalists, we've had it's been really restrictive. And so now that we find in a place where we can travel, I think it's gonna be far more valuable and exciting.
I want to make sure we touch on climate, though. I think we kind of skipped over that. And I know you're involved with the Nature Conservancy, and you have some other initiatives that you are pursuing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Tell the audience a little bit more about that.
So yeah, with conservation and sustainability, as a news person, I tackled it in one prism. I tackled it as a problem. I looked at conservation as what's wrong with conservation? What are we not doing right? And what's wrong? And I realized it was a very deafening way to engage and to talk about this conversation. And so a couple years ago, I switched it. And I said, for our conservation outlook, we gotta concentrate on the solutions. Because what I found out is that if you keep on telling people what's wrong, they actually become very disaffected. And but when you tell them that there's a solution to this, however small, they actually share that solution. It's almost even reverse engineering, that small ideas in India for conservation can be used in big places and big cities like in the States. And so I was privileged enough to have a team that continues to do news, continues to talk about the issues in climate change, but then I have a whole team that's features and we can look at the solutions of the world. And the second part of that is that we decided is that instead of speaking to the only adults, because our age group might be 59 if you're watching CNN TV, we found out that actually, and I really believe that if you want to make a change in the world, you gotta engage students, because they will graduate, they will go into the C-suites, they'll be making decisions. And I think that has been an enlightening situation for us. And so that's why we created Call to Earth Day. We started last year. We have partnerships with over 500 students, schools all over the world. And that's actually what led me to TNC. And actually Moses is our chairman for TNC, because I needed to learn. You know, as journalists, you're not expert in everywhere and everything. You need to be able to rely on credible organizations that shows you what solutions looks like, you know, and these solutions will be taking place today, but you'll bear fruit maybe years down the road. And that's what I learned from TNC and with Moses' guidance as well. And so we just did a story on the oyster reef, conservation of the oyster reef here in Hong Kong. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's a phenomenal project that they do. And so for us is to partner. We will use our platform because we know we have the largest audience, but we know that we're not experts at this, and there are experts around the world and organizations, because this is a collective project. This cannot be individually driven, a country driven, or one media driven. We have to all do it together, and we'll still even barely meet our goals, right? And so that's been something that we've been concentrating on. But I will have to say one thing: it's almost being driven by the teams. So for Call to Earth, we will be carbon neutral for that Call to Earth program, but now we're going to extend that to all of our features program, and we hope to extend that even further to all the trips that we do, which is quite a bit. If you're an international news organization, you're traveling quite a lot, but that was driven by the team. The team said, if I'm going to talk about sustainability and the solutions, what can I do as a citizen? And that's where I find it. Those are the moments that I'm really proud of what we're doing and in the organization we're doing, and that the impact that we have.
And you sound optimistic.
I'm optimistic. I look at the glass half full instead of half empty. And I'm even optimistic when I go to all these different countries that sometimes welcome us or don't welcome us. I'm very optimistic, and I'm a strong believer in multilateral partnerships. You know, the media can't do it on its own. It's got to reflect a lot of great organizations out there and people out there who are doing great work, and hopefully we can shed a light to that.
Fantastic. I think it's time for some audience questions. I think we have microphones that we'll pass around. Questions? Gentleman in the second to the last row.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this great sharing. I have a perhaps broader question. The media industry as a whole is going through a lot of changes. You know, a lot of newspapers are, struggling for survival. The internet means advertising dollars are going somewhere else rather than media channels, entertainment channels, Netflix and all that. But at the end of the day, funding actually affects how media channels are run, either your political stance or whatever. So I'm not so sure what your thoughts are in the future of, these are the sources where we get our information. Sometimes they may be fake news, they may be even be real news, but real news with a certain focus. So I just want to have a broad idea of what you think about this subject.
It's what we think about every day, because in order to do international news, it's a very expensive endeavor. CNN, we're not the BBC where we have a chunk of money given to us by, the country and the citizens. We have to pay our own bills. And so we're very conscious of that. If you think of what we do, I mean, we're not very big, actually. We're about maybe 5,000 people worldwide. If you consider that, I do believe, without any hesitation, we do punch above our weight. But we're exceptionally conscientious of what we cover, how we cover. And we make those decisions every single day. I've mentioned to you in our editorial meeting, we discuss not only what we decide to cover, but what we decide not to cover. You know, a lot of it has to do with also with budgets. We have to make sure that we're putting our money in the right place with the biggest impact that we believe we need to share with our audiences. So we make those decisions every single day, which I think is really important. I think the industry is definitely going through a lot of changes. We've seen that before. We talked about the dying of the print industry. But at the end of the day, I do believe there's room for really good quality journalism. So that's why for me, it's painful when you see certain social media outlets take your content for free. You know, that content is not free. That content is people's best news judgment, you know, when they're out in the field, you know, the exceptionalism in the journalism that's out there, you know, the work that they do. You know, I've had, for example, during COVID, for example, I've had people quarantine for like 50 plus days in order to get to that story because they felt passionate that that story needs to be told. So they said, I will do the 21-day quarantine. I will do the 14-day. That has to mean something. So when someone hijacks your content, I think that model needs to be looked at very, very carefully. But for us right now, yes, it is a business. We have to make sure it thrives. And it's important that it thrives because it protects our journalists and it protects our journalism. And I do think it's really unfortunate when you have such great journalists in different parts of the world struggling because the business model is not there for them and it doesn't support them. And so it's not optimistic. I can't be optimistic because it's something that we deal with every day. But it's not, you know, it's important who your leader is. You know, we've been lucky that we had Ted Turner who discovered that, hey, why do I have to wait for news? I want to watch it when I want to watch it, you know? And he discovered that. He said, let's do cable news. And he was also smart enough to say, when he went to Cuba, wow, there is an appetite for international news. That was 1980, I believe. So he created international news. And then 1990, I don't know what this internet is, but I think it's important. So we were the first news organizations to create an internet website in 1990. And now we're multi-platform. So we try to be wherever you are, whether it's in your pocket or it's in your television, living room or wherever, but it's definitely not a cheap endeavor. So we do need everyone's support.
Francis.
Ellana, I'm very pleased to see you here talking, and what you've been talking about. You know, all these values are the values that you at Chicago uphold very much. In particular, like freedom of expression, like diversity, and I also heard that you cover from North Korea to Pakistan. I haven't had the opportunity to visit North Korea and Pakistan, and those two countries I often find very interesting and intriguing, and I would like to know more about what's happening. From what I heard from you and your stand, I certainly share, and but what I've seen from CNN is often, you know, carry a kind of very strong stand representing the American value. And I often been told that when I was studying at U of Chicago in the 1970s, and when I talk to my American colleagues now, they often said the Americans are not the same. The Americans now is not the same as the Americans in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, I certainly thought that you know, America is like the heaven, you know, on earth. The people are very kind. I certainly, you know, have a very comfortable feeling when I was in the States. But that's certainly not what I've seen on CNN or on Fox television these days. I'm most interesting is, in particular for you, like located in Hong Kong and covering so many different countries, like North Korea or like Pakistan. Will you be able to cover it from a very sympathetic view of like what the Korean people, say, or what the Korean, North Korean or South Korean people's culture or history from that perspective to cover the news, or rather than you covering from the Americans' value or covering. Do you feel that kind of conflict with your American colleagues, or how you do about it? I would feel that you will have a very difficult position. Sometime when even as a trustee on the U.S. Chicago board, at times we are led by very right wing, like the Donald Rumsfeld, type of people, on a board. At times we are on very left wing, like the Obama people, there. So it is, how are you able to deal with all that? It seems to be doing an excellent job on.
This is where diversity comes into play. We talk about diversity, these big words, but that's where it really, this is where the battle will be fought. Like you were just talking about your board. I'm sure in your board is complicated as well. You've got all kinds of people from different political spectrums and et cetera, right? And pushing you in different positions. But your position there has got to mean something. My experience and my position and the reason I decide to stay here has to mean something. Every time there's an opportunity for go to the West, I've stayed behind. Because I actually think the story here in Asia is far more fascinating than the stories happening elsewhere. But also underlying that is I believe there's a role for me to play. And that's to be at the table and to share my perspective and my team's perspective, which actually adds value to the news that we do. Because at times, yes, it can veer towards one angle because they're seeing it from their perspective. And you know what it's like, right? When you're sitting in from London or you're sitting from New York or you're sitting from, I don't know, even Dubai, you have a different perspective of how the world is working. So for us, I believe the perspective from Asia is absolutely critical. I don't think I have to convince anybody anymore of that. But 10 years ago, we had to do a lot of convincing. I'm sure you've experienced it yourself as well. And now the best thing that I can expect is that from my colleagues who sit oceans apart from me, respect what we say and do and take it seriously. And by and large, they do. But they are different perspectives. America has become very polarized. But goes back to my other point about North Korea. The one thing I really feel quite at a deficit is because of COVID not being able to travel. Because when we do travel to North Korea, it's not trying to be sympathetic so much. And I, of all people, could be accused of being sympathetic, considering my background, being Korean, etc. But what you end up finding, my correspondent Will and I are the ones who usually go there. And what we find out is, yeah, the politicians can keep talking. The politicians can put out their antagonistic words and sentences. But our role, why we want to go, is we want to see as much as we can, even within the limitation, the average North Korean and what's important to them. And if you strip away the politics, you realize what's important to them is just as what's important to the person sitting in Kansas and the person sitting in South Korea. And that's what we try to show. But at times we get accused of being too, going to North Korea and drinking the Kool-Aid. It's not. We just want to show that those values are universal values. But you have to be given access to that. And it's because we have been able to build up a relationship, we have been allowed in. And I think that says for a lot. And that's what we try to continue to do. But it's not an easy battle. I wouldn't say America is the only polarized place right now, right? We see that all across.
Moses.
Thank you, Ellana. I have a question about geopolitics. Seems to me these days geopolitics trump businesses. It's actually could be trumping financial services in terms of what investors in the United States can invest and not what to be investing in. Suddenly, even in the university system, the research part, as you all know, a lot of very Asian, Chinese particular researchers have done so well, but during the Trump administration, it was a very, very difficult time to be Asian Chinese. I talked to last night one of my council members in New York, and she's Chinese American, grew up in Taiwan, speaks Japanese, and she has a very, very dark view about Asian Americans in the United States since Trump's ascendancy. And the Asian hate issue is very real. She was counting how many cases. And a lot of Asians are trying to do something about it. Given this environment with journalism, do you sense the geopolitics is actually trumping journalism? One example I want to get your views on is the journalist reporter from Al Jazeera who was shot by the Israeli. And there were so many different versions and investigations, and US finally came out with the interpretation was almost like an accident. The one sound I keep hearing is from Al Jazeera only, that they need to have an independent investigation. And as of now, I don't think there was any. And what's your view of that for your fellow journalists?
Well, I'll stay in the lane where I know more and I'll be comfortable with. But because of the Asian hate and the Asian American hatred in the U.S., that's also why I've joined the Diversity Council, because we have Asian American journalists in the U.S. like Kyung La and these reporters who were actually accosted on the streets. It's one thing for being accosted for being a journalist, but number two, you're accosted because of how you look. And it got to a point where that was almost like a wake-up call amongst the Asian American journalists that we have at CNN, and we wanted to do something. And so from my perspective, it was being part of the Diversity Council. And how can we make sure we tell these stories? These stories are not lost, and that we push it out internationally. So I think the polarization is actually, as you know, it's a real threat. You know, Francis, you talk about the America that you were part of. I talk about the America when I went to boarding school and I would have someone invite me to their home after Sunday service. I don't experience that anymore. It is not the America that I'm used to. And so as a result, you start to have a different experience whenever you go back, even nowadays when you go back to these different cities. So it's a part of our reality. But in terms of journalism and the hatred, I do agree with you, and I think everyone in this room would agree, geopolitics trumps everything. And a lot of it started with the polarization of American politics that has been, unfortunately, adopted by many other countries outside the United States.
Hi, Ms. Lee. Thanks very much for your sharing. My name is Terry. My question is about political pressures and also the weaponization of things, particularly in this year. I'm not from journalism. You know, I'm in financial services, but the niche of my specialty it has similarities compared to journalism, which is crediting. You know, which we issue opinions on things, and you know our value is the impact that we created. But even you know in my days in China, we constantly feel that we're in the center of controversy. You know, but there are always people pointing fingers at, hey, you should rate me higher, you should rate me lower, you know, these kind of things. But this year, the sentiment is somewhat different because I see there's a severe weaponization of credit rating. I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about globally. In light of this Russian and the Ukrainian conflict, the Western rating agencies has been, weaponized, to serve for the very specific geopolitical purpose. I think in March, because of the sanction, not just all three rating agencies dropped the ratings on Russian Federation and the Russian person, but also in a lot of press releases that I read, people are saying that, hey, Russia is obviously lacking the capability of paying the debt and also the willingness of paying the debt. But as a professional in this field, I've been in this industry for over 10 years. I know it is not. I know it is not true. Russia has been trying to, a lot of different ways, trying to repay the debt. But why is that? The sovereign rating head in one of the rating agencies is so sophisticated, so well educated, is saying stuff like that. That Russia is not trying or is lacking of the capacity to do that. I would naturally suspect that there are some political consideration in that press release that I read. So I think this is one of my personal experience in my career. I can see that credit rating as a semi-financial infrastructure have been weaponized to serve for geopolitical purposes. I also read history. In history, I would say journalism is not free from political pressure or even weaponization. Actually, last time when I was here was to attend one of the seminar here is regarding the propaganda of the Japanese war in World War II, how the media were weaponized to serve for that political purposes, even internationally and domestically. So my question is, have you come across situations like that across your career? Maybe not explicitly, but maybe in the most subtle way, to have to interface the political pressures, and if yes, how do you cope with that? Thank you.
Oh, for me, I would not say I've been in a situation like what you are describing, but I would say we're consistently always in a situation where a government would ask us, why do you report in that angle? Why do you report in that prism? So there would be a disagreement. But as I said to you in the beginning, we always come to the conclusion to agree to disagree in many ways, because we're operating in so many different countries. The best thing that we can do is try to make sure we're trying to get the angles from different parts, from different parties, and that we don't go in with one specific viewpoint, whether it's the DC viewpoint or the Paris viewpoint or the Beijing viewpoint. That is what we try to do. So if you're asking me, do we get pressure? I think it's almost a fact of life. But it's how you respond to those pressures is what I would probably concentrate more on. And I think we've been able to manage our credibility for this long is because we understand how to have those conversations. I don't think the role of journalists to have an opinion and just like put it out there and just say that's the gospel. In order to put something out there, you actually have to do news gathering. You actually have to have diverse opinions and get that. We may not be perfect at it, and there are people who would disagree with our position, but I wouldn't nowhere near go your characterization of a weaponization. There are clearly a lot of outlets out there who do that, and you can check how they've been funded. You can check who sits on their board, and you can check their management, and you will know exactly what they're using that medium for. So those do exist, but I don't want to put ourselves everywhere, even near those areas, because that's not how we operate and that's not what we stand for.
I think we have time for one more question in the back.
Hi, Elena. Thank you again for the sharing. Hopefully, with the last question, I could make it maybe a little bit more hopeful, maybe a little bit more lighthearted. I'd like to actually understand a little bit more on how you're thinking about, or how CNN International is coping with and drawing in next gen, or the change of generation. Actually, in particularly, you keep going back to diversity, right? So I'm sort of thinking about it from a different. A different parameter, but the diversity across ages, and specifically, you actually also quoted about this Hong Kong U colleague, right? So I'm interested that when you're dealing with the younger generation of journalists, where we know for a fact that they probably grow up with fake news being real news potentially. They grow up with, waking up and their source of news is social media, potentially. But we also know that these are younger generations that are a lot more equipped with technology, with a lot of other tools in their arsenal. How are they potentially being able to utilize these tools and to be incorporated into the news of tomorrow?
Well, I would say, there used to be a time in the newsroom where I thought I was the youngest one in the newsroom, and clearly that's not the case anymore. And we have a generation of young journalists coming through our doors. And what you see, in some ways, it's not so different from the values that journalists who walked through the door 20 years ago and what they wanted to do and why we're there. But I think you're absolutely right. In terms of their familiarity with the digital world that they've grown up with is definitely profound. And we use that to our advantage. So, like, for example, we've got an amazing young journalists who literally are verifying all the news that's coming through social, and we call it noise, actually. There's a lot of noise out there, and we're trying to figure out what the noise we need to consider as true valuable news and what's not. They're just faster. And they use open source far more. They're far better equipped to use all the technologies and platforms that are out there that are open source to our advantage. What we do as sort of maybe custodians of who've been around a bit is to help them build the instinct, the journalistic instinct, and the news angles that would be married with their technical skill set. Because I think even as a journalist, even for myself, you don't always make the right call. A lot of it is through failure and making wrong calls in order to know that you're getting to the right call. And that does, I think, take time. And so I do think there's a value for people like us as well to coexist in the newsroom. But when it comes to speed, also when it comes to tracking down people through social and connecting with them, because it's no longer a world where we now go knock on someone's door and say, would you like to speak with us, right? It's connecting with people on social platforms, but also gaining their trust. Because if someone messaged me, on Instagram, my first instinct is not to engage. And if they say I'm calling from CNN, my second instinct may not be to engage at all, right? But there is a methodology, and there's a way, and there's a intimacy that takes place, and they've got an amazing skill set that brings all that to bear when we produce the news. But once again, it's during the editorial discussions we'll have where I think they benefit from us, from the histories of news, which angle to take versus not to take, and what are some of the connecting points that they may not have seen as being important. And so for me, it's really encouraging that we are able to have these internship programs and we're able to hire people from these universities. One thing we are doing, though, is we're expanding it. So I'm starting up an internship program with a medical university because we've all gone through COVID. We've got now monkeypox, and reality is they have the specialties. These students have specialties in places like medicine that we don't have. And so I'm just broadening that out just from pure journalist internship to, for example, medical journalism internships as well.
Ellana, thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been really fantastic, as I expected it to be. And I look forward to many more conversations with you.
Thank you. It's been a long discussion, but hopefully it was all right.
I see the time is 6:20 in New York, so your phone is probably You're probably getting a lot of messages right now.
It's the first time I've ever turned it off, actually. So
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank
And
you very
thanks for
much.
everybody that joined us online
thank you.
and in person.
Thank you. Thank you.